Hey guys, welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Today's video is the first build guide for Season of the Wish, and it's one I'm very excited to share with you because it features an exotic and an ability surrounding a Solar Titan playstyle that I literally haven't shown off or used myself for years now. Due to some recent changes, it's become one of the strongest Titan builds in the entire game. We're capable of having infinite restoration and radiant effects, as well as chaining a lot of scorching and igniting effects that can clear an entire room of ads just off of one kill. On top of all of that, we have the ability to boost our shoulder charge damage by over 30 times its original damage, and this is enough to one-shot champions even in master level content. Before we get into it, be sure to like and subscribe for more Destiny 2 content like this, and stay tuned for an upcoming Warlock and Hunter video featuring some different build guides for this season. With that said, let's get into it. Starting off on Sunbreaker, it's really your choice for super, whichever you would prefer. I personally like Hammer of Soul, specifically when combined with Soul Invictus, but either truly works. It's entirely dependent upon your own choice. As far as abilities go, for your melee, we're doing Hammer Strike, just because we needed this to pair with Peregrine. You cannot use Throwing Hammer with this build. As far as your grenade goes, it's really up to you, whichever you would prefer. I personally like Thermite Grenade, but you can use something like a Swarm Grenade, a Healing Grenade, Firebolt. Literally any grenade works with this build. Just keep in mind, if you're going to go with a Healing Grenade, you're going to lose access to an alternative way to build up Roaring Flame stacks. So to build it up, you're going to have to start by either using your melee charge or by casting your super to initially build those Roaring Flame stacks. Speaking of aspects, the first one is Roaring Flames. This is essentially a stacking damage bonus that can grant us up to 73% damage increase to all of our abilities, and this includes our grenade, our melee, and our super. And after we have Roaring Flame stacks, your basic melee also becomes an elemental punch, meaning that you can keep Roaring Flames active just by having standard melee kills. On top of this, we're pairing it with Soul Invictus, which essentially will create a sunspot anytime we get a Solar Ability Final Blow, a Hammer of Soul Impact, or when we defeat a scorched target. These sunspots will apply scorch damage over time, and whenever you walk into a sunspot, you'll have increased regen on your melee and your grenade, as well as having a slower super drain. On top of this, it initially grants you restoration, which we can extend using a lot of elements of this build. Onto our fragments, the first one I'm doing is Ember of Eruption, and this will allow us to have a greater area of effect for our ignitions, just in short increasing the size of the explosion that's created. On top of this, we're pairing it with Ember of Empyrean, and this will extend restoration and radiance effects anytime that we get a solar weapon or solar ability final blow. In short, as long as we have restoration and radiant active, this will just simply extend that duration and refresh its timer. And I believe it's up to about 12 seconds for each. For the next one, we have Ember of Searing, and this will just simply grant us melee energy whenever we defeat a scorched target, and it'll also occasionally generate a fire sprite, which we can pick up for additional grenade energy. The main reason behind this is just to help our melee regen whenever it's not being used on a mini-boss, champion, or tormentor, because that's the requirement for having an instant refilling melee. This will just simply work in the background with everything else in the build, and helps regen our melee extremely quickly, meaning that we don't need to save it for specific enemies, and we can just use it on whichever enemy we want to, and then build back up to its full regen very quickly. The final fragment is Ember of Char, and this will simply grant scorch stacks to any enemy that's hit by our ignition and isn't killed from it. The main reason behind this has to deal with some artifact mods that I'll get into in a second, but this basically ensures that we're getting credit for defeating the scorched enemy, which helps out with Ember of Searing, and that we're not just simply killing an enemy outright whenever we deal damage to them with the solar weapon, which will cause an ignition, but won't actually grant us the benefits of scorching that target first. Briefly going over the artifact mods that are relevant for the build today. The first one is Kindling Trigger. Basically, when you're radiant, causing damage with a solar weapon will scorch an unscorched combatant. It's worth noting that this won't continually scorch combatants, it'll just apply a simple scorch stack onto an unscorched enemy. The next one we're going to be using is Flint Striker. Anytime we get rapid solar precision hits or rapid solar weapon final blows, it'll grant us radiant. This is how we'll actually have radiant, since we don't have it intrinsically on our subclass, and this is how we're going to keep it going throughout the entire build, just by getting solar kills. For pairing it with Torch, which while you're radiant, any enemy affected by a strand or stasis debuff will take an additional 5% solar weapon damage. This isn't mandatory for this build, but it is something you can easily incorporate into it to get some more weapon damage if you wanted to. Another mod I'm recommending is Heart of the Flame, particularly if you're playing with the fire team. However, this isn't mandatory for this build. In short, it'll grant your allies radiant when you cast your super near them, and the more allies that you have nearby, the greater super damage you actually deal. I believe it's a stacking bonus up to 20% and as low as 6% if you're near one ally, and again 20% if you're with 5. But again, it's not mandatory for this build, and it's mainly used if you're playing with a fire team. The alternative to that mod, of course, is Solo Operative, and this is where you're playing just by yourself, which again, this build is compatible both for solo play and with a fire team, and Solo Operative will just simply buff all damage that you do, so that's your weapon damage, ability damage, and super damage by 15%. I'm also using Wish into Being, which will allow your ability final blows to generate orbs of power when you're near full super. Again, not necessarily needed for this build, but definitely fits well into the playstyle. Next up, we have Revitalizing Blast, and this will allow any champion or boss that's hit by our solar ability to have a weakening effect, which is a 15% debuff put on top of them. The final one I recommend is Rays of Precision. While you're radiant, any solar precision final blows will instantly ignite a target. This is something we're going to be taking advantage of with a variety of solar weapons and is incredibly powerful in all levels of content. And again, these ignitions not only will scorch nearby targets and have a much greater AoE effect, but it also contributes to our general restoration and radiant uptime, as well as allowing us to generate a ton of sunspots and a ton of ability energy. The final mod that you can use with this build is From Whence You Came, but this is really only relevant when fighting Taken and Scorn combatants, as it increases your damage to them by 5%. This is something you're going to want to use if your goal is to get the most amount of melee damage you can from this build, but just keep in mind it's only relevant on these Taken and Scorn combatants. Getting into the armor and the mods then for today. Starting off on our helmet, our first mod is Hands On, simply granting us greater super energy gain anytime we get a melee final blow. And I'm pairing this with a Harmonic Siphon, which allows any of our solar weapon blows to periodically spawn an orb of power, as well as a heavy ammo finder, which just simply increases the drop chance of getting heavy ammo on a kill. And this is particularly effective when combined with an exotic primary, which is what we're taking advantage of with this build. For our gauntlets, the first mod is Heavy-Handed, and this simply allows us to create an orb of power periodically after getting a powered melee kill. While this was technically nerfed in a recent patch, it's still very effective with this build, and it's something I'd recommend using based on how often we're actually getting solar melee kills. We're pairing this with Font of Focus, and this is personally just a stat boost for me, so based on your own stat distribution or what you're actually wanting to achieve with ability synergy with this build, feel free to change this out however you want. But basically, as long as we have a stack of armor charge, we'll have an additional 30 points into Discipline, which technically helps your grenade regen. My own stat distribution allows me to benefit from all 30 points, which is why I use it, so just keep in mind that if you have tier 8 or above Discipline, you won't benefit fully from this mod. In addition, I'm also pairing it with Impact Induction, which anytime we cause damage with our powered melee attack, it helps reduce our grenade cooldown, again helping that ability synergy and that ability loop. If you wanted to replace this with another ability focus mod based on your playstyle, feel free to do that instead. For your chest piece, it's really up to you whatever you'd recommend using. I would personally go with either a resist mod, such as a solar resist or a void resist, melee resist, just depending on what activity you're doing, what kind of enemies you're fighting, or a reserve mod to benefit your solar weapons. Next up onto our legs, and our exotic for today is Peregrine Greaves. Peregrine was an exotic that I really didn't use at all in PvE ever since it got nerfed to not work with Once You Punch anymore, but now I'm happy to say it's one of my favorite exotics currently on Titan because of a recent change. In short, when used against a Tormentor, Champion, or Mini-Boss, its damage will amplify from its normal 225-ish% to 1000%. And when used against these enemies, it'll grant you a fully refunded melee charge. This means that if something doesn't flat out die from your initial strike, which is boosted by a ton of different sources we'll get into in a second, you already have your full melee charge back that you can just simply run in and hit them again with. Now, just how much are we boosting our damage with this build? Now, I've done some testing and I want to go over kind of what I found, but as you can see from some of the background gameplay, even in stuff like master level content where I'm extremely under light being this early in the season, it's something that can flat out one-shot champions, and even against unstoppable champions, for instance, that might take a few more hits because of their higher damage resist when they're not staggered, just simply hitting them 2 or 3 times in total with this build is enough to flat out kill them. Briefly going over just how far we can amplify our damage with this build, with Peregrine we can amplify our melee damage from our shoulder charge by 1000%. We can stack this on top of Roaring Flame's 73% damage boost for our solar abilities, and even pair it with something like Revitalizing Blast, which will intrinsically give our solar abilities a 15% debuff when used against champions or bosses. If you wanted to though, you can also use Tractor Cannon with this build and get a 30% debuff instead of Revitalizing Blast's 15%, but just keep that in mind that you do have your own intrinsic debuff with this build without Tractor Cannon. Some other sources for a damage boost also include Solar Surge if it's the proper week for it, which will boost your solar ability damage by 25%. We can also include this with From Whence You Came, which is the artifact mod that boosts our damage against taken and scored enemies by 5%, and if we're playing solo, we can also use Solo Operative for a 15% damage boost. Now, if we utilize all of these, we can achieve almost 40 times our original shoulder charge damage in just simply one melee, and again, it auto-refreshes when used against a Tormentor, Champion, or Mini-Boss. With that in mind though, we're typically not going to have all these modifiers working on every single melee, so with that in mind, if we eliminate Tractor Cannon for just Revitalizing Blast, for example, which is a 15 instead of a 30% debuff, we take away From Whence You Came, and we aren't fighting a taken or a scorn enemy, and even if it's not the right surge that week, we can still achieve over 30 times our original damage with this build. And even with this lower form of damage boost, again, it's still something that can one-shot champions in most levels of content, and if it is something that for whatever reason lives that initial melee, simply hitting them 1 or 2 more times is enough to flat out kill them. Again, I'm talking unstoppable champions without staggering them, Tormentors, most mini-bosses. It's an incredible amount of burst damage we can output with this, and again, this build is designed to kill these enemies. It's not necessarily a boss killer, but a champion killer. As far as mods go, I'm pairing this with recuperation so that anytime we pick up an orb of power, it'll instantly replenish our health. This is mainly used in combination with our intrinsic restoration effects and is something we can take advantage of with heavy-handed for this build, allowing us to get an initial burst of healing after we get our melee kill. I'm also pairing this with 2 solar weapon surge mods, which will boost our solar weapon damage by 16% anytime we have a stack of armor charge. Onto our mark, the first mods I'm using are 2 stacks of time dilation, and this will simply bring our armor charge decay effects through solar weapon surge and font of focus from a 10-second duration to an 18-second duration. The final mod I'm using is powerful attraction, which will simply pick up any orbs of power nearby when we activate our class ability. However, this mod is mainly just used because of my own playstyle and experience with this build. If you want to swap this out for an ability regen mod or a finisher mod, for example, you can absolutely use that instead. Finally, let's talk weapons. The first weapon I want to recommend for this build is particularly an enhancement option, and it's mainly using Riptide, which is available from Shaxx, and it's just something basically anyone can get just by rolling Crucible weapons. The main reason we're using Chill Clip is because we don't need to rely on artifact mods to get something like Unraveling Rounds for our strand weapons, and it's very easy to apply. On top of this, something like Riptide can actually stun all 3 champions when combined with Radiant's effect, not that we really need it though, and it's something that easily fits into this build to enhance our solar weapon damage. However, with that said, basically any weapon with Chill Clip will work perfectly fine with this build. For solar weapons though, the first one I want to recommend is Vex Mythic Class. Now Vex was a weapon that was already good before this season, but going into Season of the Wish, it got a massive list of buffs. The first thing is it does 10% more damage to minor enemies in general, which is just a nice quality of life bonus to this weapon. On top of that though, it also got a 200% damage bonus to its alt fire mode, which means that each shot is dealing 3 times its original damage. Factoring this into the fact that its catalyst grants it its own intrinsic damage bonus, and we can benefit from radiant and surge bonuses on this weapon, means that this thing hits incredibly hard. If for whatever reason you don't want to go over and one-shot a champion with your instantly regenning melee ability, Vex's alt fire mode is able to 1 or 2 hit them even in higher difficulty levels of content with ease. On top of all of this, Vex is incredibly easy to get multi-kills with or just simply land a few precision hits with, so it can easily grant us Radiant, and upon getting these kills, not only can it activate large ignition effects with Race of Precision, but it also keeps our Restoration and Radiant effects going. And on top of all of this, it also helps with our melee regen by killing those specific enemies, while helping with the Scorch application and ignition effects. Vex Mythic Class is 100% my recommended exotic for this build. However, I do understand that it is a raid-specific exotic, so if you don't have it, let me go over some alternatives that also work very well. For exotics specifically, I do have a few recommendations. Specifically, Sunshot is already a monster and ad clear for PvE, and it's just a general good solar exotic, and it works perfectly with this build by basically allowing it to have a secondary igniting effect on top of its already high damage explosion. Something like Ariana's Vow also has some anti-champion capabilities. It is also a good alternative for a harder hitting exotic special weapon. And then of course you have your other favorite solar primaries, such as something like Devil's Ruin, Tommy's Matchbook, Kiku's Divination, and Hierarchy of Needs. All these are great recommendations that I think fit perfectly with this build. As far as legendary alternatives go, pretty much any solar weapon that's able to reliably get precision kills is great with this build. As far as legendary alternatives though, really any solar weapon that's able to reliably get precision kills works great with this build. I personally like the BXR55 Battler, which can roll with Pugilist and Blunt Execution rounds, not only granting it a ton of melee bonuses on top of everything else we already went over, but also helping us regen our melee energy back with Pugilist. Something like the Aquila Sniper Rifle is also just a very good solar weapon in general and fits perfectly with this build, but again, as long as you can hit crits with a solar weapon, it fits in perfectly. As far as heavies go, you can really use whichever one best fits your playstyle. I like using this Incandescent and Subsistence Unwavering Duty just to help with general ad clear because I really don't struggle with single target damage with this build, but you can do something like Apex Predator, which in my opinion is one of, if not the best rockets in the entire game. Something like Throne Cleaver is also a class-specific option that fits really well with the aggressive playstyle of this build. For exotics though, you can also use something like Galahorn, which is just one of the best weapons in the entire game in general and fits in perfectly, allowing it to be boosted with Radiant and Solar Surge effects. If you wanted to achieve the highest melee damage possible with this build, Tractor Cannon is going to be your weapon of choice, again replacing that 15% debuff from Revitalizing Blast with a 30% debuff. The final heavy weapon I would recommend for this build is Dragon's Breath. The main reason I'm not particularly using it is because I don't have its catalyst yet, and so I'm not entirely sure how well it truly fits in with the rest of the build. However, it does have some really good synergy with the igniting and scorching effects that are automatically built into this playstyle. With that said though, it's something that its igniting and scorching effects already contribute a ton to this build, and while it doesn't have as high damage as something like Apex Predator for instance, it is a really strong fit for this build if you wanted to use it. All in all guys, that's the build for today. Like I said earlier, this is one of my favorite playstyles currently in the game, mainly because I haven't used Shoulder Charge and Peregrine for such a long time in PvE, and I'm very excited to see it finally have a viable niche even in endgame content. Again, with this build, we have constant Radiant and Restoration effects, as well as a ton of Scorching and Igniting effects, and to top it all off, we have a melee that can reach almost 40 times its original damage, and can flat out one-shot champions even while we're 25 light under mastery level content. This is a build that is handcrafted for endgame content, and I really hope you guys enjoy it as much as I've been enjoying it. If you liked the video, be sure to like and subscribe for more Destiny 2 content like this. Again, I'm already working on a Warlock and a Hunter build, so stay tuned for those, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I greatly appreciate your continued support on these videos, and have a great day.